The next item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on UK coronavirus legislation. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell for 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, can I start by echoing the words and sentiments of the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport earlier this week. We are, as a country and across the globe, facing an unprecedented set of challenges. None of us have experienced those challenges before. We can only meet and defeat them if we work collectively to protect, sustain, support, nurture and help each other. Addressing these challenges will mean change, profound and sometimes difficult change for us all. Every life will change. Nothing will be and can be the same from now on. But we need to change with hope in our hearts. We need to change with a determination to look after ourselves, our loved ones, our communities and our future. The First Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, the Deputy First Minister and other Cabinet Secretaries have already outlined to this Chamber the steps that are being taken. Today I want to talk about the necessary legislative changes we need to bring about quickly in order for our nation to change and respond in the most effective manner. The first tranche of these comes in the UK coronavirus bill, for which the Scottish Government will recommend granting legislative consent. The Four Nations Coronavirus Action Plan, published earlier this month, set out measures to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak and information on the four-stage strategy: contain, delay, research and mitigate. The Action Plan outlines a collective approach, reflecting the closely indicated planning process established to help prevent the spread of the outbreak and combat the impact and consequences of it. This includes reference to legislation that might be necessary in order to ensure that public bodies across the UK have the tools and the powers they need to carry out an effective response. The bill introduced today at Westminster underpins the Action Plan. It is the result of a great deal of intensive work between the UK Government and the devolved administrations, unique and extraordinary given the virtual standoff on other legislation that has been the norm for the past 3 years. And it's required because of the extraordinary public health and economic challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic. We're grateful to everyone who has been part of that process, and particularly the officials across all the governments and many departments who have worked tirelessly to make sure the bill is now available for scrutiny and passage. Of course, the Scottish Government has made clear that, while we acknowledge the benefits of alignment across all four UK nations, it is also important that devolved matters can be fully analysed and considered against the emerging situation here in Scotland and the specific measures and action that we and others need to put in place to respond to that. It's good to know that that position has been respected, just as we have respected the need for specific measures and actions in the other three nations of the UK. Presiding Officer, it is clear that this bill cannot be scrutinised in the way we would all normally wish. The immediacy of the unprecedented challenge that Scotland and the UK faces at this time do not permit that. However, we must also be conscious of the fact that with any legislative urgency, no matter how extreme, must also come a parallel and urgent recognition of the concomitant need to be vigilant in the protection of human rights, particularly of those who are least able to protect themselves. I hope that those at Westminster and more widely who are rightly concerned that, for example, the 2-year sunset period for this bill needs to be looked at very carefully and safeguards put in place for regular reporting, review and renewal if required will be heeded in their concerned and constructive criticism. The intention here is for a legislative consent memorandum to be considered at committee on Tuesday morning and for a motion to be debated by this chamber on Tuesday afternoon, subject, of course, to the Parliament's agreement. The legislative consent motion does not require renewal, nor is there a statutory reporting function for this Parliament and the Scottish Government in the legislation, though there is for the UK Government. However, I want to make a commitment here today that we will institute, after discussion across the Parliament, appropriate reporting on how and when the powers in the bill have been used by the Scottish Government. And in our own further emergency coronavirus legislation, which we hope to bring forward to put other urgent legislative changes specifically for our own competencies on the statute book, hopefully before Easter, we will embed such reporting and renewal, including on our use of provisions in this bill, into law. Presiding Officer, the measures in the bill cover a range of topics and sectors and include bespoke provisions for Scotland to reflect our different legal systems in devolved areas. Combined with measures already being taken by the Scottish Government and our partners, they will help in assuring our health and social care services remain effectively resourced, protect people, and assist in slowing down the spread of coronavirus. There is one very important point I want to stress here, and on which I anticipate that assurances will be sought as the bill undertakes its passage across the UK and devolved parliaments. This is that creating these additional powers does not automatically mean we will be required to use them, or that all of the powers available to us will be implemented at the same time as the bill gains royal assent. We of course recognise the immense seriousness of the current situation and the further risks we now face if, as the scientific advice indicates, we are now on the cusp of a rapid escalation in the spread of the virus. The next few weeks and possibly months will be a uniquely difficult time, when the people of Scotland will be asked to take unprecedented action as part of our collective efforts to protect our citizens and, as the First Minister said, to save lives. In using the powers we have and will gain, we will always be guided by the principle that decisions will be taken at the appropriate time on actions and measures to be taken based on the situation here in Scotland and other parts of the UK. Moreover, we will use those powers in the appropriate way, informed always by our own response planning and by ongoing joint work with the UK Government and other devolved governments. Presiding Officer, let me briefly outline some of the measures in the bill in a little more detail, though there is a great deal of detail in the bill. The areas of action in the bill can be broadly categorised as, firstly, additional public health measures to assist with containment or to mitigate the spread of the disease, including powers relating to events and the ability to effect screening for potentially infected persons. Measures to allow for increased numbers of health and social care workers to join the workforce, for example by removing barriers to allow recently retired NHS staff and social workers to return to work. Here in Scotland, in addition to retired persons, this will also include those who are on a career break or are social work students who can become temporary social workers. The relaxation of certain regulatory requirements within existing legislation in order to ease the burden on staff who are in the front line of our response, enable reduction in emergency tasks and the prioritisation of care towards those with the most significant and urgent needs. Measures to ensure management of deceased persons with respect and dignity in acknowledgement that we have already seen tragic loss of life due to this pandemic. And provisions to support the economy, including issues around statutory sick pay, which are aimed at ensuring that coronavirus impact on small businesses and individuals is lessened. The bill contains a range of powers that can enhance our response and ensure that action taken can be enforced. One example is on the powers within the bill to require information to be provided by those within or closely connected to a food supply chain, where a failure to comply with a request or to provide false or misleading information will attract a financial penalty. But of course, a route of appeal is also set out in the legislation for many of the enforcement actions. Presiding Officer, the bill contains a range of other items of importance, and the accompanying information from the UK Government is now available online. I'd be happy to talk to my opposite numbers in other parties about the detail, and I have suggested that we get together by phone later tonight or tomorrow in order for us to do so. I'm also happy to inform other members of the Chamber if they have questions. Presiding Officer, I've used the word unprecedented several times in this, but of course that is in our time. It is not in all time before us. As a nation and as a generation and as a civilization, we have been here before. The experience of pandemics is not a modern one, but a very ancient one. Again and again, humanity has had to face this challenge. It's been recorded and commented on by countless individuals. It's led to great reflections on what it is to be human and to be part of a society under threat. And the common thread in all of those works has been not just fear and worry for oneself and one's loved ones. It's also been a thread of community solidarity, concern for all of those around us, generosity of spirit and action, and hope for the future. It is a thread that emphasises a shared belief in human creativity, ingenuity, and survival. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Asked Bertolt Brecht just before the Second World War. And he answered himself by saying, yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. On the wall outside this Parliament, there's a quote from Fletcher of Saltoun about the relationship between the songs of a country and its laws. We are going to need both to see us through. I reluctantly leave the singing to others, but as to the laws, I will do all I can, with my colleagues and with this chamber, to put in place what we need to get through. We must do the right thing for everyone. We must take action to protect, to enhance, and to strengthen not just our response, but ourselves. As part of this effort, I look forward to engaging further with colleagues across this chamber in the coming days on this vitally important piece of legislation and further legislation we will require to bring. Let me finish, as I started, with the sentiments expressed by the First Minister. We should all thank the people of Scotland now and going forward for all of their effort, concern and understanding. It will still be needed in the weeks ahead, but together we can and we will win through.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement, and I will allow around 20 minutes for that. It would be helpful if those who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons, and I first of all call Myrtle Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and also for advance sight of it. We are dealing, as he said, with an unprecedented set of challenges, and that requires an unprecedented approach. Can I warmly welcome all he had to say about the level of engagement there has been between the Scottish Government and the UK Government and the other devolved administrations, and join with him in thanking all those involved in a process which has required very rapid and diligent action. And can I pledge the support of the Scottish Conservatives to the proposed legislation and our cooperation in taking it through Parliament as expeditiously as possible in these circumstances. In normal times, there would be concerns about the human rights aspects of some of what is proposed. But we are not in normal times. We are dealing with a crisis, and this requires a different approach, where we accept that some freedoms will have to be curtailed, albeit in a measured and a time-limited fashion. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary two questions on his statement? Firstly, by what date does he expect the legislation to be enacted, should it complete its parliamentary passage at Westminster? And secondly, the Cabinet Secretary referred to further emergency coronavirus legislation to be passed here. Can he say more about what that legislation is likely to cover?
Michael Russell.
Well, can I thank Murdo Fraser for his remarks and for the indication, the support that he and his party will give. I'm very grateful for it, and we will need to work closely together. And I repeat the offer that if I can offer more information to Mr Fraser on the phone. We don't often talk on the phone, but I'm sure we could find a way of doing so this weekend to talk through the detail. And I would stress the detail that does exist. This is a complex bill. It is a bill that covers all the four nations of the UK, and there is much in it that we need to absorb. On his 3 points that I want to respond to. First, on the human rights aspect, I appreciate what he says. But as I indicated in my statement, we have to balance that, the requirement to act with urgency, with a continued concern for human rights. And I had a conversation at lunchtime with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, with the chair and with certain of their staff, and I'm committed to speaking to them again as we develop our own legislation. And I have indicated that I want to make sure that we put in place a reporting function here, which is not in the bill, but which we need to do so that we are accountable to this chamber, and also indicated that I have sympathy with those who wish to query the situation presently of the 2 years. And I think it is possible to envisage a different set of processes that might go into place. In terms of the date and the urgency, it is likely that the House of Commons will consider this on Monday, and this is still unconfirmed completely. We would intend to finish our entire process on Tuesday, as I've indicated, first by committee appearance on Tuesday morning and then by chamber on Tuesday afternoon, subject, of course, to the Parliamentary Bureau accepting that. It is likely, I believe, that the House of Lords will consider the bill on Wednesday and Thursday, though that, again, is not confirmed, and the bill should then have royal assent by the 31st. So the bill will then be in effect. Though there is commencement for some items in the bill on the 31st, there is therefore the need for regulation on other items. There are some triggers in the bill which we would have to, for example, declare certain things to allow parts of the bill to take place. So that all needs to follow on. But our aim is to have it through on the 31st. Finally, in terms of our own legislation, and I know the First Minister has been very open with the Chamber, and I'm very happy to do that too. I circulated Cabinet Secretary colleagues this morning with a note which asked them to bring forward their proposals. We already knew of proposals from the Justice side, and I think Aileen Campbell indicated yesterday a requirement for a legislative change in terms of her own area. There may be others. I would aim to have the information on what Cabinet Secretaries require, for example, on ways of expending money and other things that may require legislative approval early next week. I would hope that we would be able to bring an emergency bill to this chamber, again, subject to the Bureau, and I know my colleague Graham Day will be speaking, or has spoken to members of the Bureau about how this will work. I would aim to have that emergency legislation in the week before the Easter recess. That is a very urgent timetable, but of course it will require a lot of cooperation and a lot of discussion about what should be in that bill, and I'm committed to that discussion.
Alec Rowley.
Presiding Officer, these are indeed unprecedented times, and there is a need for the legislation that we are discussing today, but we should always be vigilant of protecting human rights, and that should remain a principal position. However, I do believe such legislation should be renewed every 6 months in order to be accountable to Parliament. I very much welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say and look forward to the further emergency legislation coming forward, in particular the fact that he says we will embed such reporting and renewal, including on our use of the provisions of the UK bill and law, I think is a very much welcomed statement. Can I ask, would he look at a 6 months rule in terms of bringing that back to Parliament? And finally, something that's not been mentioned, but there are those out there who are using this situation in order to cash in on a crisis. We've seen that with some charges, significant rises in prices for hand wash, for example, and some people buying up stock in order to cash in. Can this legislation, or the legislation he's looking to bring forward, protect those and certainly deal with those who are unscrupulous at this difficult time?
Michael Russell.
I welcome the very positive contribution from Alec Rowley, and I look forward to working with him on this. On the issue of human rights, I'm very open to considering in our own bill what the appropriate period is. Clearly, that has to relate to scrutiny, but also to the likely length of time in which we would need regulation. So I'm happy to look at it, but 6 months would seem to me probably the maximum period that one would go for. And there may be arguments to have reporting within. I think in terms of formal reporting on this bill, it has to be more regular than that. There is a commitment in the bill for the UK government to report every 2 months. I would have thought that given this Parliament's committee structure, we would want to make sure the committees were engaged in that as well. I mean, the focus of our work going forward, for certainly the foreseeable future in this chamber, will be on the issues of the coronavirus pandemic and how Scotland responds to it. And therefore, I think committees and this chamber will want to make sure that the work being done through this bill and other work is scrutinised, and there is the opportunity to discuss and debate it. The member raises an interesting point. I think that Kenny Gibson raised an issue about a particular product earlier in the week. I think all of us, our constituents, will be telling us about circumstances in which they are in which they're noticing price rises. There are some powers in the bill to do with the food supply chain, and particularly to do with information. I suspect that they are limited. And I suspect that they could perhaps be used to get information, but not to do much more. There is the normal criminal law, but if there is a requirement to take additional powers for those circumstances, and we are able to do so, because of course certain powers such as trading and trading standards rely outside this Parliament, but if we have the power to do so, then be assured we will take them, because it is vitally important that people realise that we are a community and we need to treat each other with respect, and we do not profit from that.
Understandably, these first questions and answers have been lengthy, so if I could ask for brevity from now on, there's a lot of people want to ask questions. Patrick Harvey, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the statement, and Greens will also be constructive in bringing what scrutiny is possible to this legislation over the coming days. But what struck me from an initial reading was not so much what's in the bill as what's not in the bill. There's nothing to mandate an increase in statutory sick pay, for example. The measures on compensation for emergency volunteers only cover loss of earnings, therefore ruling out those who've already lost their job from becoming emergency volunteers. And indeed, there's nothing beyond information provision on food supply that would allow public authorities to acquire stocks of food, household essentials or hygiene supplies in order to prevent price gouging. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that these changes would be welcome in the bill, and will he join us in urging the UK Government to consider them?
I certainly think that despite the shortness of notice, the debate at Westminster on Monday needs to be very comprehensive. These are precisely issues that need to be discussed. Where there is this, I suspect this is also the first piece of UK legislation, but not the last piece, and we will therefore also have our legislation. So in all those circumstances, I think there should be a vigorous debate about it. I'm personally sympathetic to the points that Patrick Harvey makes. If we can find a way to influence those at Westminster, fine. If we can find a way to do them ourselves, fine. I mean, I think the work that's been done together on this bill is hugely significant and very important, but we all have freedom of action within our own areas. That is protected within this bill. If we can do that, we will do it.
Willie Rennie, followed by Emma Harper.
I mean, I think these powers are inevitable in these extreme circumstances. Nevertheless, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will understand my nervousness that the powers will last for more than 2 years under Clause 76(2). Would the Cabinet Secretary consider it appropriate that we have parliamentary renewal perhaps after 90 days with another periodic renewal thereafter in order to keep public confidence? And the powers to enforce the health protection regulations requires to be made by affirmative procedure under Section 81. When would the Minister think it would be appropriate that that would be done?
Michael Russell.
On the second point, when those regulations come forward, and that will require a decision to be made, which requires to be scrutinised by this chamber on the trigger event, as the member will know from the bill, but that is the type of issue that we need to discuss. On the issue of 2 years, I've indicated I do think that requires very careful reconsideration by the House of Commons. We cannot alter that in terms of a legislative consent motion, and there is no procedure to renew a legislative consent motion. So what we have to do is to be imaginative in the use of powers. I've indicated that. The first piece of imagination that is to make sure that when we bring our bill and any subsequent legislation, we are building in best practice. So it won't be 2 years. It has to be shorter than that. And the second issue is to voluntarily indicate that we will come back to this chamber to have scrutiny of everything we do under this bill, and when we can build that in as a legal requirement, as I hope we will be able to do in our next bill, then we make that retrospective. So we are doing so in terms of the provisions of this bill. I think that's the right way to take it forward.
Emma Harper, followed by Miles Briggs.
Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what engagement there has been with relevant stakeholders? He mentioned the Human Rights Commission in his response to Murdo Fraser earlier.
I was so surprised that we had a question that was short. Thank you very much, Ms. Harper.
I hope it's
Michael Russell.
I shall try a short answer. The work on this bill has been undertaken by officials up until essentially now, this week, and they have talked to the stakeholders with whom they normally deal. I have been involved in this bill for something like 48 hours, perhaps just slightly more, but I spoke today to the Human Rights Commission. I will be speaking to others. I wanted to speak to the Human Rights Commission, Scottish Human Rights Commission, particularly to express my concern and to hear their concerns about the bill, and to make sure that we could establish connections for the next piece of legislation so that we can try and get it into a position we'll all be more comfortable. There are, for example, and the member being a former nurse, or indeed a current nurse, I know, will know that some of the mental health provisions in this bill are very concerning, and I think we need to be very alert to the issues that they raise. That's not to say they shouldn't happen, but we need to be alert to issues that they will raise for very vulnerable people.
Miles Briggs, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you. The measures brought forward around sick pay to be brought forward to 1 day are welcome. So can the Cabinet Secretary clarify whether Scottish patients will be able to obtain the so-called isolation note, and whether or not this will be through NHS 111 website or nhsinform.scot? And given the implications that the school closures are going to have on the pay sector, what conversations have taken place with payroll companies so they can carry on and get their staff to make sure that people are paid on time?
The member may forgive me, he has the expertise of being a health spokesperson. I do not. I will make sure he has an answer to those points, if there is an answer. I have to say this bill has changed quite a lot in the last 48 hours. So some of the sick pay provisions were not in it 2 days ago. In these circumstances, I suspect a lot of work is being done to work out how they will operate. But of course, we will try and secure that information so that people have it.
Monica Lennon, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. The emergency legislation that's been laid at Westminster removes the requirement on the need to carry out social care needs assessments. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the intention behind that is only to remove bureaucratic processes, and can he give assurance that everyone who needs care will still be able to request it and access it, especially those who may be given early discharge from hospital?
The bill does not remove the obligation on local authorities to provide care. What it does is it removes the obligation to undertake a full assessment if that assessment cannot be taken in such a way that will expedite the delivery of social care. So it is, if there is a difficulty in the bureaucratic system, it reduces that. There is concern about that because some local authorities may have difficulty in getting assessments underway, but the bill is careful in how it does that. It needs to be examined closely at Westminster. If we have things we then need to do, this is a power that we have, we can then look at refining the process. We are aware of that, but it is important that we move it forward quickly.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In light of the ongoing concerns, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the Scottish Government and the UK Government will maintain regular ongoing dialogue to discuss whether and when each respective government plans to use the powers set forth in the bill?
Michael Russell.
As I understand it, the Secretary of State's reporting powers at Westminster on this will include a reporting that of items that we have undertaken and the other devolved governments have undertaken. I also intend to make sure there's reporting here. Given that we have got to this stage, and actually I am very heartened that we've got to this stage in terms of the content of this bill, which, as I've said in my statement, was far, far more integrated between the administrations than anything I've seen in the last 3.5 years, then we'll commit to continuing to work together to try and ensure that we know what each of us is doing.
Liam Kerr, followed by John Mead.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In relation to managing the deceased with respect and dignity, the bill intends to remove the need for a second confirmatory medical certificate for a cremation. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any thoughts on how appropriate safeguards can be put in place absent that second certificate?
Michael Russell.
It is a difficult issue. There are a number of procedures, ideas within this bill and proposals within this bill which will simplify the situation in terms of registration of death and change some of the obligations upon crematoria and local authorities. And there are obligations on crematoria and local authorities, for example, in the storage of ashes, which would require quite a lot of action in terms of tracing families, which could not be undertaken if there was pressure. What we really need to do is to make sure that any period of suspension, which is not automatic, any period of suspension is very short-lived indeed, and that we are aware of the difficulties it may cause in the area that Mr. Kerr is indicating. There are other areas in the bill where we would look for as short a period as possible because there would be a removal of a second or confirmatory signature. There is a process of review of death certificates, which undertake the random process, which is undertaken, which the pressure, if there was pressure on staff, we would not be able to undertake. But we would want to make sure there was still some random checking, which is a very important safeguard. So how we apply this, the delicacy with which we apply it, is quite important. Some of the bill contains, for example, in the educational areas relating to the Deputy First Minister, very precise targeting powers. So in actual fact, you can target it right down to individual establishments. And we need to make sure we can do that as carefully as possible.
John Mason, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary has been stressing the integrated nature of the bill between the 4 countries. Can you say anything about, will, for example, commencement all happen at the same time across the 4 countries? What about suspension? What about use of the powers?
Where the powers lie in devolved competence, and the bill is quite clear about that, where the powers lie in devolved competence, then the decision of Scottish ministers on suspension, there are provisions in this bill which can be operated and then suspended and reimposed. That will lie with Scottish ministers. Where they are reserved areas, they will lie with UK ministers, but there are also areas in which consultation with Scottish ministers will have to take place. We would not intend to, as I've said earlier, immediately implement all of this bill. That would be utterly inappropriate. But if you read the bill, you will discover there are places where we can take action when we believe it is appropriate, and there are trigger points which we will get to and then we will address.
Due to the importance of this issue, I've decided to give another 5 minutes for questions. So that's Sarah Boyack, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement? I was wondering, will the new bill add any new powers that will be needed by local authorities to act over the next few weeks and months? One issue that's been raised with me is the issue about powers around by-elections and whether they are cancelled or not. And is it possible to have an additional note about that issue? And are you involved in discussions with COSLA on those issues? Thank you.
Michael Russell.
Yes, there are a variety of powers for local authorities. We've mentioned social care assessments. The powers in by-elections are quite clear, and this has been a complex discussion between the administrations. But what the bill does in terms of Scottish by-elections is it will give the power to cancel by-elections, local authority by-elections, to the returning officer, and Scottish Parliament by-elections, should there be any, to the presiding officer, in both cases consulting with the Electoral Registration Board and Scottish ministers. A by-election due to take place in Clackmannanshire East today was cancelled at very short notice. I apologise for that, but this was to do with a change in policy with the UK Cabinet Office, which we were late to hear about yesterday. But from now on, I mean, this will be a decision for returning officers, but I would find it highly unlikely that there will be any local government by-elections, certainly between now and the summer. There are a number due to take place in May, and I just think they will not happen. In terms of by-elections here, then there are none pending, but were there any, that would be a decision for consultation. I have to say, in terms of, just so I answer this and put this on the record, there are no proposals in this in terms of the Scottish Parliament election next year. There is already a legislative process for that were it to be required. But of course, one hopes that that will not be required, but we will keep everything under review.
Stuart McMillan, followed by Adam Tonkin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what role the Scottish Government has had in ensuring that the policy paper outlining the legislation accurately reflects the areas of the legislation that fall within the devolved competences?
Michael Russell.
We believe it does. I mean, I can't vouch for every single word in it, but I believe that it does. And of course, we are making here clear our position, and there will be other material that we can publish if we choose to do so.
Adam Tompkins, followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned human rights in his statement. Now, under the Human Rights Act and under the European Convention on Human Rights, countries can derogate from human rights in time of war or other public emergency threatening the life of the nation. Can I ask this? Is it the Scottish Government's view that the coronavirus crisis is or might become a public emergency threatening the life of the nation within the meaning of Article 15 of the ECHR? And if so, does the Scottish Government, sorry, Presiding Officer, and if so, does the Scottish Government anticipate that it might in due course become necessary to take powers that derogate from certain of our human rights protections?
I don't want to give a definitive answer to that. It's probably not for me to do so in any case. What I can say is I recognise it. It was a subject of discussion I had briefly with the Scottish Human Rights Commission today. There is no doubt that there is a balancing act to be had with the ordinarily grave nature of the emergency that exists, and we will work at the best we can together to face that emergency. Whether or not I'm prepared to use those words in the way that Mr Tompkins used them, well, I suspect it's for others to do so, not for me.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank Presiding Officer. Given the unprecedented nature of the emergency we're facing, Cabinet Secretary, do you agree that it might be inevitable that there will be some mistakes made with this bill, but actually what is more important is the speed that we get this through Parliament to protect the people of Scotland? And can he confirm that the LCM will be coming to the Finance and Constitution Committee, and has further consideration in regard to the Scottish Government's bill been given to using the whole Parliament chamber to consider that particular legislation rather than allocating it to any particular committee? Because I think that might not be a bad way forward.
Michael Russell.
I think both of those points of view are very well made. First of all, in terms of using the Parliament as a committee, essentially a committee of the whole Parliament, that will be for the Parliamentary Bureau to decide, but it would seem to me an interesting proposal. So we will certainly be willing, if that is the mood of the Parliament, we are absolutely willing to do so. In terms of mistakes, yes, I do accept that. I mean, this is legislation that has to go through. I'm amazed at the speed at which officials have been able to bring this to a fully formed state. We have a lot of work still to do. This bill will not be perfect. No bill that this chamber has ever received has been perfect. But it is absolutely essential we do it now.
That concludes the statement and questions from the Cabinet Secretary. Apologies to Neil Findlay and Andy Whiteman for not being able to ask their questions, and we'll move on to the next item of business.